Okay, I'd like to dedicate this to a very important client of mine who I love very dearly, Jackie Saul, otherwise known as Yehudah, Yaakov ben Yehudah. He's a South African guy who was an all-round brilliant tennis player and a great family man. I only got to spend 4 months with him, helping him in the last moments of his life while he was, going through the last bit of heart failure. And we grew very close, and he's very special to me.
Thank you. May the shir be an aliyah for his neshama. Kevin's going to start out with essential concepts before I start the Gemara shir. And Kevin, kindly teach us.
Okay, so just one idea that might mushroom into other ideas, but it says here in Parashat Ki Seitzei that one must be honest with weights and measures, and it says following the list of commandments to assure a fair and honest society. The Torah states that Hashem's abhorrence for dishonesty goes so far that it is forbidden for a Jew even to own inaccurate weights and measures. And it says in the Sforno, Hashem abhors dishonesty and will not permit his holy land to be a base for such activities. There was a certain individual in Joburg who had a food establishment, and the guy wasn't religious. And when people bought confectionaries from him, I'm not going to mention his name, he didn't include the weight of the container. He deducted it, only charged people for the weight of the actual food or confectionery. He wanted to be, and this guy wasn't a religious guy. He really bought into this concept, and he wanted to be as scrupulous as possible. So people think that only like observant people do things, but sometimes non-observant people, that Gavin and I were discussing earlier, sometimes they're more strict and they're more straight than religious people. And we need to also not judge them and gossip, and not that we should do that anyway, especially this time of year. And none of us are squeaky clean, and we need to get our own houses in order. But this guy was, it was very important for him to be honest with weights and measures.
Thank you, Kev. And on that note, sometimes I think the reason, one would think by logic that somebody that's observant knows Hashem commanded him to be honest, and therefore feels the trepidation of the spiritual repercussions of not being so in the next world. However, the converse way to look at it is somebody that's not from and doesn't have all the obligations and the other details, are realizing quite clearly that it's going to come down to the ethical and moral behavior, and therefore seem to focus on the scrupulous nature of that compared to Torah observance, because it's a more narrow focus, which is sometimes creates more of an ethical dimension than somebody that's juggling too many balls. So, Kevin, it's a weird thought. We're going to ask something into the Gemara.
One other thing, sorry, I worked before I came on Aliyah. I worked at Powerhouse, and we had a set price list for the products and the installations and the training. And there was a Jewish woman there. It was actually quite embarrassing who worked there. And she says at the top of her voice, I'm going to add on 15% to the price. So in front of everyone, I said, you don't do that. That's dishonest. You can't do that. It's bad for the company's reputation, and you're being dishonest. How can you add on an extra 15%? There's a set price, and you charge what's the advertised price is.
You're correct. You're 100% correct. And in fact, that's what we're dealing with in the Gemara, are these issues about robbery and thievery, etc. So let's get back into where we were holding. We were holding on the 112th daf. And we were dealing with the situation in a brisa that if one robs something and feeds it to his children, they are not liable to pay the owner for it. Now, if you remember correctly, in the view of Rav Chisda, they are exempt only if they consumed the item after the owner reached the stage of Yehush. And according to the Rashba, what we mean by Yehush is that there is a concept of almost acceptance and despair of the current situation of theft. And therefore, if the item is consumed and it's no longer in existence, on that basis they're exempt. And also after a stage of Yehush. Now, according to Rami Bava Kamma, they would be exempt even if they ate it before Yehush, if you remember. Now, so we say that if the robber left it before them intact as an inheritance for his children, when it says the word for him, for them. So in other words, he robbed it while it was alive, and let's just say it wasn't consumed as in food, but maybe grains of maize or an animal, etc., etc., and they consumed it when they already received it as an inheritance. In other words, it's not as if they consumed it while the robber was alive. The inheritance process occurred first. According to this brisa, it doesn't agree with Rav Chisda on first glance, nor Rami Bava Kamma. And it says at that point, the heirs are responsible and are liable to pay if whether they are adults or minors. So the Gemara says, okay, hang on a second. Let's digress a bit. And the question is, are minors liable? Because we learned before in Bava Kamma that even if a minor damages, he would not be liable. So we said there are three types of people that are not liable. Do any of you remember?
People without no legal capacity.
That's conceptually absolutely correct. So
minors who what? Because they
or somebody that suffers from retardation, as you said, they've got diminished mental capacity, and anybody that's raised teenagers have known, especially from everything from the stupidity of teenage pregnancy to children playing in the barn with fire, is that the consequence, the whole thing of mental incapacitation, retardation, limitation, of consequential linkage between cause and effect is what gets somebody off the hook. And we also use the word a deaf mute. Now, when we say deaf mute, it means that person hasn't got the capacity legally to testify, and they might suffer from some form of retardation. So in that case, the damager is not liable. Neither are the minors liable in this particular case. According to Rav Papa, who said, this is what the brisa is saying, if he left it before them intact as an inheritance and they did not yet consume it, whether they are adults or minors, they are liable to return it. So quite clearly here, you see a difference of opinion between Sumchus, who holds that a minor is never liable, even for damages, and the opposition to Sumchus, who says a minor is liable, just as an adult, if the object is intact and it had not been consumed, and they have to return it. Okay, they have to return it. So the ruling that we learned before was problematic according to both Rav Chisda and Rami Bava Kamma, because if you remember, the brisa's opinion contradicts Rav Chisda, because the heirs would be liable only if they consumed the article before Yehush, before the despair. But if we read the first clause of the brisa, it indicates that in his view, that the brisa must be speaking of a situation after Yehush. Otherwise, it would contradict Rav Chisda. Okay. So that's the first problem, is that the price is seeming to say it's after Yehush, and after Yehush, it's okay. Now, according to Rami Bava Kamma, a third party who consumed stolen property is never liable, regardless of when he ate it. Okay, so we're saying that it is in this particular case. So we're going to learn the nuances and the differences. So, an Amoraic ruling regarding heirs who inherited property from their father that had borrowed. We use the term inherited almost as a term because inheritance usually means you own it. In this particular case, Kev, are you okay? You're falling asleep?
I'm listening. My eyes are closed.
Okay, no, that's okay. I thought my talent for putting people
No, I'm listening.
Is somebody that only when they get smicha. So I was kind of excited. So now, what's this inherited property that their father had borrowed? It's a contradiction in terms, because if you inherited something, it's yours. In other words, it's left to you as a possession. So the Gemara uses this term inherited as almost a catchphrase for heirs that borrowed an article from that their father had borrowed. In other words, they continue using it. So you've got Shmuel, who borrows a cow from Reuven, and the children continue using the cow that they borrowed. So what are the rules in terms of borrowing? Does the status quo of what the arrangement is, whether it's rental or borrowing, etc., continue, or are new rules set up for the heirs, or do they automatically inherit the rights of their parents?
It stays until, let's say the agreement was for 5 months and the guy died after the first month, they still have use of it for another 4 months.
Okay, so Arthur did do some research from Rabbi Cohen, I can see. There are certain provisos. Arthur's correct that that's certainly the opinion of Rava. So well done, Arthur, for listening to Rabbi Cohen. With the days you've had, I don't know when you're at Talmud, that's amazing. So Arthur says exactly like Rava, who stated...
Actually, I need to correct you. It was actually you the other night talking about it, about use 3 months or 5 or 4 months, and then the guy died and he still could use another. You actually mentioned it, so I was remembering from that as well.
Oh, well, okay. So Rava said, if their father died and left them a cow that he borrowed, they may use it all the days for which it was borrowed by their father. So so once one who borrows something acquires the right to use it until the period of time that he borrowed it has elapsed, according to the Ravad. If the borrower dies during this period, the right to use it is inherited by the heirs, and that's discussed in Ketubah 34b and by the Rashba and the Ravad in terms of Rava's opinion. Now, we're going to discuss this issue about what their responsibilities are, etc. So, just one thing I wanted to mention with regards to the brisa that we learned before with Rav Papa is that if you have a look, we learned in Bava Kamma 112a2 that if a minor, somebody that's a deaf, mute, or mentally retarded, enters somebody's premises and damages his possessions, he's not liable to pay. So the inference here is the minor should be likewise exempted to pay if they consume the property of another. But as long as the stolen article is in existence, even minors are required to return it, since actually, guys, it belongs to the owner. It never belonged to the robber. That's according to Rashi. So that has nothing to do, and this is very careful to listen here, between the dispute between Rav Chisda and Rami Bava Kamma. Why? Because their discussion has to do with a third party who consumed the stolen property. Okay? In our particular brisa, we're saying that it hasn't been consumed yet. So it's not a contradiction. So according to Rami Bava Kamma's view about inheritance, namely that it constitutes a change of domain with Yush, the brass has to be explained as referring to a situation before Yush, and that's why the inheritors, whether they consumed it or not, have to return it. Otherwise, the heirs would acquire the article through a combination of the despair of the Yush and a change of domain. So if you look at it, you might say, but hang on, Dave, we dealt with this case on Thursday about a different brisa, that minors need not return the stolen article, and that was according to the view of Sumchus. Okay, minors can never be sued in court according to him. But there's Sumchus disputants that say, well, the sages in general, that minors can be sued in certain circumstances. So now we are dealing with a case where what happens if you have minors and the father died and they borrowed it? We're not talking about a thief anymore. This is a legitimate case. Do the rights go on to the children? And the answer, according to Rava, is yes. It certainly does. According to the Ravad, he concurs. He said for the period of time it was borrowed. The father, as Arthur remembers me saying, had an arrangement for 5 years. He died at the end of year 1. There are 4 more years where the children can get the benefit of borrowing the animal. Now, there are certain rules. Now, we're going to discuss when these rules are, because things will go wrong. So, if the animal died, they're not liable to pay because they're not responsible for unavoidable mishaps that befall it. Okay? Now, I wanted to ask any of you guys, I know Kevin's exhausted and Arthur's exhausted and Gavin's exhausted.
Yeah.
As far as a borrower is concerned, does a borrower have to pay for unavoidable mishaps or not?
Yes,
I would also think so, yeah.
the borrower has more responsibility than normal.
Arthur, I think that a malach taught you in your dreams, and I think
He said, oh, coming back to me now.
it's amazing. Amen. So I think that we can honestly say that Arthur not only answered correctly but gave the reason, and that reason is the more somebody is doing you a favor, the more responsibility you take on. The more you're doing them a favor, the less responsibility you take on. As I said, if Kevin decides to go back to Israel and he says to me, Damon, I need you to look after something for me in South Africa. And if he says, if you lose it, I'll sue you. I'll say, Kevin, go to our friend Nicholas and ask him to do it because I don't need the headache. If you turn around to me and say to me, Day, please look after it while I'm away, and I'll say I'll do my best, but I don't want drama, then Kevin will have to accept that because I'm doing him a favor. If while Kevin's away in South Africa, I don't have a spare car because Gavin's using the car for the business, and I need to borrow a car, Kevin's going to say to me, I'm doing you a favor. Listen, if anything goes wrong with the car, there's an unavoidable mishap or anything like that, you need to be responsible. I would have to say yes, because Kevin's doing me a favor. So Arthur answered it perfectly well. There is an exception though. What is a borrower not responsible for? Guys, it was a question. There's a very uncomfortable pause.
Theft.
No. Kevin, if you lend me a car and somebody steals it, why must you lose out on the car? Of course, that's what insurance is for today. I mean, it's a more sophisticated development that occurred over time. But in principle, either way, I'd have to reimburse you or replace the car. It's not theft. Guys, I'll put you out of your misery. It's if it breaks within its normal usage. We don't mean from abuse. In other words, Gavin borrows the car, and all of a sudden, I know it's too close to home, that example, because I don't want anything to happen to the car. Shmuel and Ruvain. Ruvain borrows a car from Shmuel, and what happens is Ruvain's driving it, and the head gasket blows, and the engine blows. Now, if Reuven got any indicator where the temperature gauge shot up like that, he is responsible because although it happened, he could have prevented it by watchful observance of the temperature gauge. But let's just say there was a mechanical seizing of the engine and no head gasket was blown. And it had been used for years and years. And this was the first day that Reuven borrowed it from Shmuel. Would Reuven be responsible for the car engine? Yes or no?
No,
Why?
because the wear and tear was there in the past. He simply started the car, started going, and boom.
Exactly.
He didn't do any damage or whatsoever. It was simply worn out.
Exactly. So if you borrowing Bessie the cow and that cow's been worked half to death, and the day you borrow it, the animal drops dead, out of no unavoidable mishap or negligence on one's part, a borrower even then is not responsible. So we are saying, okay, so since a borrower is responsible for unavoidable mishaps, because if I borrow a car from Kevin, I have to, if somebody hits the car, do I have to pay for repairs? Yes. If somebody steals the car, do I have to be responsible and pay Kevin back? Yes. That's what insurance is for. But Kevin's entitled to, when he's doing me the favor, get it back. He's not entitled to get money from me if I borrow the car for a day on the engine that took years to break down, and now suddenly it happens to be my timing. That took wear and tear long before I got in the scene. So unavoidable mishaps are something that as the borrower, I'm responsible. So why are the heirs that got the benefits of the borrowed car not responsible, according to Rava, for unavoidable mishaps, since their father would be as the borrower? And if the arrangement is continuing, why are the heirs not responsible?
Is it not because it's not the direct person, it's a secondary person down the line, indirect?
Okay, Arthur, may Hashem bless you.
No? Right?
Perfect. So may Hashem bless you with good health and a good year and Salman, guys. And
Amen.
perfect. So exactly as Arthur said, a borrower is normally liable even for unavoidable mishaps, which is an honest, like the death of an animal, etc. The engine seizing in a car is a different example, but the death of an animal is something that is responsible. I don't mean if the animal's sick, but if they but in other words, not if it was something that he never caused, but any sort of negligence. I think a car's even a better example. They worked it to death, they left it in the sun, they didn't give it, etc. Those are negligence. An unavoidable mishap, I think, is probably the animal stumbled and fell. Let's put it that way. So the heirs never took responsibility as a third party for protecting the animal. So Arthur says, like Rashi, so they can't be held accountable for its death. Now that's according to Rashi, that the third party is not liable. The Rosh doesn't agree. Now I understand where the Rosh is coming from, because the Rosh says that that leniency applies only where the owner allowed the animal to remain in their possession without it making any stipulations concerning it. But, guys, according to the Rosh, the owner does have the right to demand that they either return the cow or accept the responsibilities of a borrower. So you can turn around and say, listen, this arrangement for the responsibility was taken on your father. If you're prepared to take on the same responsibilities as we had with him, all well and good, you can borrow the animal. You're not doing me any favors, I'm doing you a favor. Otherwise, I'm going to take the animal back. Rashi said the third party continues for the remainder of the period to borrow the animal without any responsibilities as the third party. Okay. Because he's explaining the Gemara. So, that's for an unavoidable mishap. And unavoidable mishap is not negligence. It's something that is not their fault. Otherwise, it would be deemed negligence. Okay. So, Kevin, there was a separate issue in the Gemara, and that issue is if they thought that it was their father's cow and they slaughtered and ate it, they pay the owner the value of the cow's meat when sold at the cheap rate. I'm going to explain what that means. Now, why is that? Why would they have to pay if they thought it was their dad's and they slaughtered and ate it?
Wouldn't
Wow.
it be okay? Carry on.
Why would they have to, if they thought it was okay, Arthur? Okay, go ahead first.
Hold on, my son's talking. Give me a second.
Okay, do you want me to repeat the question, guys? Gavin, Arthur, just not?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the
Dave?
question. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Just repeat that again because I just slipped my mind. Why would he? Why would? Oh, okay. Because they had the intention behind. They didn't know it was the actual animal or somebody else's. They thought it was their father's.
Yeah, but then nobody heard the question. So the question is as follows.
Ah.
Arthur's saying
Yeah.
correctly. He's saying, well, why should they be responsible? Because they didn't know it was somebody else's. They thought it was their father's. They inherited the animal. They slaughtered and ate it. So why are they responsible in this case, but not with an unavoidable mishap? Okay. Any ideas?
Just thinking now. Well, again, okay. But besides the fact that they didn't know, again, it's also by they're further down the line. Again, it's not the
No, you
direct
missed the
person. Well, the
question.
father killed it.
You missed the question.
Ah,
The question is the opposite. The question is, since they're a third party that had borrowed, they're the heirs of the borrower, and we said before that when there was an unavoidable mishap, according to Rava, there's no responsibility for the heirs. Why in this case, when they slaughtered and ate the animal which they thought was their father, they were responsible? So,
why they were responsible?
yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that last part. That was my mistake there.
Because they pay the owner the value of the cow's meat sold at the cheap rate. So they're paying less, but they're responsible. Yeah.
So it's a happy medium. You know, they made a mistake. That guy doesn't lose out totally. They pay the fair amount. They had a good meal at discount. So I'm going to go eat everybody else's cows. If I can get meat at discount in Israel, I'll be very happy.
So that's a good point. So what do they say? What do they say is the cheap rate? It's not a happy medium. A happy medium would be if they pay for half the market value. But the cheap rate, according to the Gemara, in Bava Basra 146b, is 2/3 of the market value. Okay, and I'll tell you why. They don't have to pay the full price of the meat, because had they known that they would be required to pay, they might not have eaten it. They thought, okay, they inherited it as a free gift. So now that they are responsible, they only have to pay 2/3 of the rate. They don't pay half the rate because that's unfair to the original owner. So number one, they pay 2/3 of the rate, not half. So it's not where it's a compromise. It's more in favor of the owner. Secondly, they've got to return the cow's hide to the lender, as mentioned by Rashi. So guys, since they had no idea they were destroying somebody else's property, they can't be held liable for the full value as a damager. Okay, so the only monetary liability is to pay for the benefit they received, and that benefit is assessed at 2/3 of the market price. Because it's common for people who generally couldn't afford to eat meat that if there was a discount, they're not going to get a discount of 50% off. Only at Pick and Pay, when the food is half rancid, do they give you a discount. But even then, it's a third. It's not even half. But when the food is fresh, it's only a 2/3 discount, because it's common that if there's a discount, people that wouldn't ordinarily eat meat because of unaffordability would consume it. So we say we can presume that if it was done at the special price, they would have consumed it. So they do get a heck of a benefit, the heirs. But the reason why they pay is quite simple. Well, there are two reasons that I'm going to give. The one reason, according to the Gemara, is that An unavoidable mishap is if you're looking after somebody's dog and it gets hit by a train, it swallows a bone, something without human intervention. Gab, you falling asleep? Kevin, you falling asleep? Guys, give me just
I'm listening.
No, but
I'm
I
listening.
don't blame you guys.
my
I don't blame you guys. All I'm saying is the reason why there's culpability at the cheap rate of 2/3 of market value is that it was human intervention that damaged the owner. This wasn't the animal dying on its own accord, because an unavoidable mishap resulted not from negligence, which is human intervention in a way. In other words, negligence, people can still die if you don't feed in your children, or you don't give them adequate medication. That negligence is culpable homicide. There's human intervention, but it's not an action that created the damage, it's a lack of action. So when human interference causes responsibility, there's a higher level of responsibility as opposed to the animal being met with an accident, as opposed to negligence. Negligence is also responsibility. In this particular case, they caused the animal to die. They cut it, they killed it, they ate it, they got benefit. We say that, no, they would never have eaten the meat if you know. You say, yes, you would have. If you got the meat in 1/3 of special, most people would eat it. So yes, that you have to pay for. Why should the owner have to have a loss of half? It's not his fault. It's not like a case where he's partially responsible for the problem either. Therefore, sometimes Sumkha says we go halvies, but not in a case where the person should have asked the obvious question. Well, how do we know the animal is ours, and how do we know it's not borrowed? That's why there's liability. If they're using the animal and the animal just dies or meets with an accident during use and there's no negligence, well, we can understand that unless the owner came to the borrower and said, listen, if you want to carry on with the borrowing arrangement, you have to assume responsibility like your father did, according to the Rosh. Otherwise, I'll take the animal back. According to Rashi, third party, such as heirs that inherited the borrowing rights of the animal, are off the hook. All right. So, what I'm going to say, guys,